So in the disaster recovery world, we're going to start with just talking a little bit more about continuity of operations when it comes to staffing and IT. So we're going to start with Ron now, coming back from break. Ron, what are your initial thoughts when it comes to what to be worried about past the response phase? We've addressed life safety. We might still be sheltering or going into some long-term sheltering. But where do we focus when it comes to information technology and our staffing?
Again, it comes back to it takes a village, and I like the comment this morning about recovery starts with day one of response. So IT is going to be continuing on with their efforts to communicate with the rest of the recovery team. Where are we? Again, that daily email, the team meetings, getting together to talk about it. The goal, again, is to continually assess where we are with recovery and keep working on that until we're fully restored on all of our services and systems. So that may include backups, recovery of servers if they were damaged. Again, communications is going to be the key to all of that, is the underlying communications of where is staff, what are they doing, and IT's role in facilitating those channels. So whether it's updating the website, if that becomes your communication portal, making sure that that's operational and staying updated. And probably the first question from anybody on the team is what's working. The second question is when will it be working if it's not. So keeping in touch again with the IT team, the operational team. If you have supporting teams like your managed service provider or internet provider or any of those things, staying in close communications so that from an IT perspective you're able to update the rest of the team on when these things are going to be coming up. So in a larger environment, a larger city environment, you may have parts of your city that are up or down and other parts that are working. Again, helping coordinate and get your teams operational where they need to be. The supportive communications are something we didn't talk about so much yesterday, but one of the things would be if you had to set up a call center. So if you had a lot of calls coming in, help facilitate setting that up to get information out as well. If people were calling in, be able to distribute that information, have a scripted line about what's up, the daily update on where we are, where we're going, what's available, what's not, as an alternative to websites as well, but keeping both of those flowing. And then lastly, really the continual conversation about the restoration of services. So I mentioned this yesterday, I think, in passing, but the epicenter of the disaster, the impact of it related to the everyday operational services you're providing, starting to look at the calendar with your team. So is this going to impact my HAP run? Is this going to impact payroll? And staying in communications closely with the operations, accounts payable. We have to pay our bills to get the materials we need. Some of the basic day-to-day stuff, but it's really the prioritization of the recovery of services that your system of record and other systems that you may be working through in IT to ensure that they're brought up timely. Again, if your computer system's down, you're trying to restore it, you have a HAP check run, and it's going to take you longer than it's going to take to get that back up. Bad news early is good news. So keeping your team informed about what we can do, what we can't do, when we expect it to be able to be done is going to be very important to that recovery. So not much else on that. Again, it's a continuation really of that response and gradually building up the momentum till at some point we're back together. It may be including of backups. So I mentioned that yesterday. If your day-to-day is very transactional, you have a lot of transactions hitting, maybe to look at how frequently you're getting backed up to see what that tolerance is of data that we could have lost and have to recover. If it's a one-day window, you have a whole day to recover and you have a lot of transactions, you may look at that and say, I need a shorter window of every 4 hours or something like that. So again, the echo back to a cloud-based solution gives you some options to do some backups that are more automated, more frequent, that you could recover in a smaller time frame and lose less time. depending on, again, budget and the way your systems are.
Thank you. And on the other piece, there's the staffing piece. So think about some of the things that we can talk about as well, as far as that coordination with staff to resume their normal services. Ed, what did that look like for you as far as returning to the office versus remote work? Also, you talked a lot about losing staff. Did you rehire? Did you work with your residents, with the advisory board? Like, what did this look like?
So in the fog of disaster, we came into the disaster in 2018. I believe COVID was popped into our world in January of, was it 2020? So, you know, in the middle of our disaster response, we get COVID, and so this dizzying affair of trying to staff our agency, Save the Section 8 program. Again, we have 38 staff altogether. So we lost 6 of them in the disaster. They lost their homes and couldn't stay in the jurisdiction. So there was a lot of hiring that went on over a lot of years, which put enormous stress on the agency. So that's something to be aware of, is that you're going to be dealing with HR big time in the event of a disaster, particularly if they affect any of your staff. Yeah, and then coming back into the office, those are dark days. I say dark literally. There was smoke in and outside of the office on a regular basis, but really taking care of staff, the air cleaning, the support, the local support, the nurturing of staff, you know, just being able to say good morning warmly to each other, acknowledging this environment we were in. I guess, you know, there's a lot of this that I look back on, and it's kind of foggy, because there was so much going on. We're really plodding through our days one day at a time, one event at a time, one issue at a time, meeting by meeting. And you know, the whole world is shaken in a disaster. All of what you assumed is normal and functional, whether it's water systems or power or internet, or everything comes into question. In a town like Paradise, where you get the 90% of the urban fabric wiped out, you're looking at creating a whole new community. And we don't, in America these days, you know, set off and establish communities of 20 or 30,000 people in one fell swoop. But that's really what's happening here. You know, one of the first things we discovered in the disaster, you know, Paradise is rural, it's all septic. So sewer was not an issue, but the septic tanks all had to be tested. We found out that the water supply to the town ran through plastic valve boxes, and all the valve boxes were burned. So the entire city's water system had to be reconstituted before anyone could even occupy a building that might have survived, much less apply for building permits to build new housing. So there's all these formative issues that you never imagined you'd really have to cover. Everything has to be revisited. So there's a constant process of reinvention. You're looking for scraps of opportunity, because there are not great pools or swaths of opportunity in terms of disaster recovery tools. And so really, I keep coming back every time I have this conversation. It's all about local empowerment. It's about your network. It's about what you can do with your network, your local control, because your state's going to be spinning with other political considerations as stakeholders, and the federal government certainly has their constraints. So your greatest freedom and your greatest empowerment will be your own agency, yourself, your staff, and your community, the strength of your network in your local community, because that's really where it all starts. And you know, one of the things I wanted to mention here, the politics of all this. You're managing politics, and there's a politics of perception in all these different communities, particularly if you're a regional or an area housing authority. The expectations of the public, as I said yesterday, the public wants to see this problem go away in a news cycle. You know, a few weeks, 6 months of transients or temporary housing is enough. When are we done with this disaster? Well, we're 5 years into it now. We still have 6,000 homeless displaced residents that we're negotiating in our community. They're living doubled up, tripled up in tents. They're living in garages. They're living in attics, trailers, wherever they can, by hook or by crook. Some of them legally, many of them illegally. And ironically, okay, one of the underbellies of our housing authority programs, we look to program integrity in public housing in Section 8. We only want authorized household members to come live. Well, in a disaster, I guarantee you, your low-income residents will be sponsoring other displaced households. Is that the good news or the bad news? in one sense, it's actually good news. I mean, it's an abuse of the federal regulations and the federal programs we administer. On the other hand, you're housing people. These are shelter nights that you otherwise wouldn't have. So you kind of have to pick and choose where you look and where you reinforce at different times. It's a moving environment, a moving trajectory, and it's filled with distress.
I had a question for you, Ed. So you think about, like you said, your public housing really wasn't impacted as much, but I was thinking about my Section 8 team, like my inspectors. I'm sending them out into the community to look at properties as I'm getting back to something that looks kind of normal. Did you do anything to help them be prepared for things that they might see, or coach them up on getting back out on the road for kind of that work?
Well, our HQS inspectors inspect properties that are theoretically approvable, and when you have nothing but dust on the ground, there's not much to inspect. So really the issue in terms of the shock value for anyone driving up to the town of Paradise, I saw pictures, aerial photographs of the community after the burn. It looked like Hiroshima. And so just the graphic nature of that destruction is breathtaking. As I drove up into my own area where I live up in the canyons, the destruction of the houses, it's like living in a war zone. I've never been in a war, and God forbid any of us should be in a war, but that's kind of what it looks like. So there's a shock value. Not so much affects the inspectors. Our inspectors they're our ambassadors, are welcomed by the landlords. They have no problem, but they're inspecting properties that are intact. We're talking about a huge swath of community that's been erased.
I didn't know about like water or smoke damage or things like that they may not have been thinking to be looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in Paradise, we started to have units actually coming online shortly after the disaster. The few units that did survive, there weren't any multifamily units that survived, but we do have voucher holders leasing up in single-family properties up in Paradise. And it was a little bit, it was interesting. We had to invent a protocol for water. Because there was no potable water. The city couldn't assure the water quality. We had to invent a protocol for landlords to establish their own water quality to us to satisfy our HQS standards. So we had a certification. We'd have the landlord go out and get a professional to come and test the water and provide a certification that the water was potable, independent of the local jurisdiction, and we would accept that, and we'd house somebody on that basis.
Wow. So I'd like to pivot for a moment, and let's talk, I would like Nicole to explain a little bit about the CDBG-DR process based on the disaster that we had here in Washington. Nicole, if you can just give us a little bit more about the disaster, like the profile of kind of the actual disaster,
Sure.
and what that looked like of getting a CDBG-DR allocation for the state of Washington.
You bet. Oh, is my mic on? There we go. Okay. Alrighty, well, so as I mentioned before, this was Washington State's first DR allocation in a couple of decades. It was in response to the 2021 atmospheric river and flooding event that affected half a dozen counties, but most impactful to Whatcom County. And so some things to know about CDBG-DR. So as forbid, a disaster occurs, you'll be dealing with a lot of things, and I'm sure trying to cobble together the various funding sources and opportunities that are available. And so a little bit of background on the DR disaster recovery grant process. So I heard FEMA say that they consider themselves funding of last resort. I will say that HUD disaster recovery funding is not only considered a last resort, but it is also not response in any way. It is rather recovery. I say that because of the things that need to happen before you can get funding. So first, presidentially declared disaster. Second, Congress has to appropriate the funding. And so they don't always do that. There's no specific schedule. You may or may not get on the list. As I said, Washington has certainly experienced presidentially declared disasters in the last couple of decades, but this is the first disaster that Congress has decided to appropriate funding to us. with that said, I think that in large part, we kind of got tagged on to Oregon and California's 2021 disasters because they allocated us $30 million for, again, for potentially all 6 of the disaster-affected counties, but HUD identifies the most impacted and distressed area. In this case, that would be Whatcom County. And so there's good and bad things about this funding. The first is that there's a timing situation. There's, first of all, the uncertainty about whether or not Congress will appropriate any funding to you, if it's the appropriate scale. So our unmet needs analysis for this disaster, covering all half of a dozen counties, was $15.1 billion in unmet need. That remains after, and when we say funding of last resort, this is after FEMA, after the state EMD, after private insurance, after everything. The timing of this grant is extremely front-heavy to stand up, especially if you haven't received a recent DR grant. And so the timing, even for well-oiled machines, maybe like California or some of the southern states that have continual, what seems like continual DR allocations, the timing of this grant is best case scenario, very best, probably pretty unrealistic, is 1 year down the line after the funds are allocated from Congress. Then, of course, then HUD then does their allocations and has to put out their notices, and so there's a timing thing, and then also the front-heavy administration. So, worst case scenario, you could be talking 3 to 4 years after the disaster when the HUD DR funding gets out on the ground. So Washington's disaster was in November 2021. I can tell you that we are not even under contract with HUD yet to release the funds. We are doing the pre-release of funds administration. So there's a timing aspect to this money. That's kind of the negative, as well as HUD DR funding comes with a lot of strings. Their primary focus is housing, in all honesty. So maybe that's a nice complement, though there's the timing aspect, a nice complement to maybe where FEMA's not focusing on housing as much, but housing, and then also low moderate income. And so that is the primary national objective. You need to spend 70% of your grant toward low moderate income recipients. So there's, and your disaster is income blind, obviously, and so there's some strings. There's a lot of cross-cutting as well. So your Davis-Bacon and labor rules, your procurement. There's a lot of your Section 3. Yes, there's a lot of cross-cutting, and so again, it's administratively heavy, but it could potentially fill the gap regarding permanent infrastructure and housing needs. Another good thing is that it's pretty darn flexible. I mean, in terms of the number of activities you could do. Again, there is absolutely a focus on housing. So PHA, that is the ticket I can tell you HUD would be most interested. And I think you've already hit the LMI mark because of your clientele and your properties. Okay, so how do you get your hands on this funding? So again, if it's presidentially declared disaster, if Congress appropriates funding to the DR program, then HUD allocates funding to your state. So the first thing, what drives the programming for how you intend to use the funds is the unmet needs assessment. So the recipient or the grantee of DR funds will be collaborating with all the folks here at this table, all the community members. PHA is very critical. This is where your COOP comes in. What are your damages? What money have you already received? What's your remaining unmet need? What's in the pipeline? What would you like to do? Is that new construction? We can pay for anything like, golly, we need to reconstruct a portion of our property. DR can pay for temporary housing while the building's being worked on, et cetera. So many potential uses, but those are having a good COOP, being able to easily assess what funding have you already received for what purposes? Because again, no duplication of benefit. What's your remaining unmet need? Having maybe some plans in the pipeline. So you tell us you tell the DR grantee what your unmet needs are. And then, so that's your opportunity to get input. And then also once the action plan comes out, which details the proposed use of funds and how they would be administered, there's also a public comment period that's another opportunity. But I think really it's the closest collaboration point and the most impactful is during the unmet needs assessment. So that happens after the funds have been allocated from HUD to the grantee, in this case the state of Washington, and letting us know what are your needs. Again, HUD is very interested in housing and specifically assisting low moderate income beneficiaries.
Thank you, Nicole.
You bet.
So the next piece of that is making sure that housing authorities are aware of this timeline, knowing who's going to be receiving the funds for your state, or if there's additional allocations. Sometimes there's also, say, if it were to be an earthquake in Seattle, Seattle may receive their own allocation as well as the state. So that's something to be mindful of, is making sure you're aware of how many allocations there are for that disaster within that geographic area. Next piece is really at the recipient level, so at the Washington level, is the action plan. And being aware of what that looks like so that maybe the PHAs can also influence what the recipient's approach to utilizing the funding.
You bet. So the public action plan is, again, the grantees' pre-release of funds, document outlining, again, the unmet needs, both recovery as well as mitigation, giving a general outline of the event, and then your proposed use of funds, along with a bunch of cross-cutting stuff and, bureaucratic gobbledygook. So that can take quite a while to put together, as one can imagine. We've been working on ours for about 1.5 years. And so, again, we're to the stage of it's been turned in to HUD and we're waiting for approval. That will then trigger the release of funds, and we can actually start opening up, the application period and implementing our programs. So again, here we are in 2024. We'll say Washington did get a slow start for a variety of reasons, but this timing is not unusual. So, so again, we go back to the timing of this grant, that this is funding of last resort. This is recovery, not response. The work, that your use of funds needs to be tied to the disaster, other than the mitigation component. The mitigation monies, which is a minimum of 15%, doesn't necessarily need to have a direct tie back to the initiating disaster, but rather can be forward thinking in terms of resiliency for all future disaster types. But again, the bulk is around housing and LMI, and huge variety of activities that are eligible. But yes, there's a huge administrative process. So again, we called all the PHAs in the affected areas and said, tell us what's happened to you, what have you done, what is your remaining need, what does that look like, and we included that, of course, in the unmet needs assessment, which is a large portion of the public action plan. What else did I want to say about that? There was another component. Sorry, I don't remember. That just spaced off. This is my third day in a week that had to leave the house by 4:30 for work
No
things.
worries, we can come back to it. I'm sure there's plenty.
On the action plan, they have to do public comment sessions and show who was there, what type of discussion they had, what types of comments they received, how they responded. And I will tell you, I was looking for the word yesterday, part of my schizophrenia, so I'm going to say we when talking about HUD. So we found that, disasters, especially floods and hurricanes have and tornadoes have a way of finding the most vulnerable people in a community, right? But floodwaters don't knock on your door and ask you how big your bank account is either. But what we found was that some communities were trying to socially engineer their communities after disasters, and did not want people you serve necessarily to come back, right? If they were displaced and put someplace else, then let them go. I actually listened in on a city council meeting in Galveston where a city council woman said, well, what if we give our money to Houston so Houston can house our poor people? It was that blatant, that open, right? And so what HUD did, and the first time this was made explicit, was said, okay, grantee, show us the conversation you had with your housing authorities, with your continuum of care, on what their unmet needs are. Make sure that's in your unmet need analysis, right? And if there are unmet needs that they identify, to the extent that you can, since they're serving the most vulnerable in the community, the LMI people who should be getting priority with this money, show us how you're meeting those needs. And so the CDBG DR regs and notices are written with a very strong bias towards your residents, the people you serve. It's in most cases, I mean, I did the math, I was pretty good at math, but I couldn't do it in my head. She has, if she has a $15 billion unmet need and only has $30 million, that means she has 0.002% of her unmet need to allocate. She ain't gonna fix these problems with the CDBG-DR, and it is, as she said, really the money of last resort. And that's why I told you all yesterday, if somebody from FEMA is telling you in the days and weeks and months after the disaster, oh, HUD's going to take care of that with CDBG-DR, then ask that person, you're guaranteeing that this Congress is going to work together to do something to address a problem in my community? Because that's exactly what they're saying, that there's going to be an act of Congress that's going to happen, that's going to meet a need that you all are still trying to get your arms around. So no one can say that and say it with any degree of credulity. So do not ever believe someone when they say that. HUD is not going to take care of it. Congress just doesn't. I was responsible during my time at HUD for over $33 billion in disaster funds. There was only one allocation that exceeded the amount, our analysis of what the unmet need was, and it was because I told the biggest lie I could to OMB about what that number was. The people who went into the meeting with me at HUD said, I mean, they were shaking under the table, like, how are we going to justify that number? And I knew that the political moment was right. It was Hurricane Sandy, it was New York City, and all the places around it. It was an election, a presidential election, and we got it, right? We got it, and we were able, and so some of the things that are commonplace now, using money for mitigation, the whole, the competition, that was one time. It hasn't happened since. I never saw it happen before. So even in Katrina, like there were 3 separate Katrina allocations, and it still wasn't enough. To your point, Katrina's anniversary, 20th anniversary is next year. They just closed the housing program for Hurricane Katrina last year. Okay? This money of last resort, it's slow in coming, just as you were saying, and it takes a long time to spend. So do what you can with whatever else you can get, and don't rely on the HUD, CDBG, or DR. But be in the
Icing on
meetings.
the cake.
Yeah, it's the candles.
But I think what we're hearing here is setting realistic expectations,
Yeah.
knowing what's
Yes.
potentially coming down the pipeline so you can plan on a blue sky day, and even after that response phase. Knowledge is power, expectations, and being able to further set expectations for your residents, for your politicians, knowing when that you need to, when your politician's calling right after an event, and, you know, because they want to be the heroes and they want to say that they fixed things, and you're getting that phone call, don't say, I don't know. Always have something in mind that you ask them when they call. And so whether it's, you're going to be asked about, you know, what our unmet needs are, there's a lot. Here's all the things you can have an impact on state budget, on federal appropriations. So this is, I think, a huge part of this from the day the event happens is, and I heard this from another emergency manager at a county level who says, Brittany, I always have in my head 3 things, never more, but I always have 3 things the second I get a political influencer or anyone else that's coming in, that comes in, you know, shake hands and take pictures or calling so they said that they can talk, is I never say I don't need anything. I never say I'm too busy, because that way it gets them thinking and it makes them feel good and they can run with that. Yes.
A couple notes on CDBGDR. I like the way you call it a funding source of last resort, because in disaster response, actually, it's for us on many of our projects, it's a funding source of first resort, because without the CDBGDR commitment, we don't have a viable project that we can then leverage. So it's actually really important money. The other thing about CDBGDR that we love is that we're familiar with the operating environment. How many people here are afraid of CDBG? I mean, it's just another federal program operated out of HUD, right? I mean, many of us operate CDBG or in partnership with other entities. It's a familiar animal. So CDBGDR is just a little bit different spin on the same old friendly CDBG program. So it's a great source of funds. Interestingly, in disasters, we touched on this yesterday, how the CDBG-DR funds flow into your jurisdiction from the feds is important. In the Trump administration, funds came directly to the jurisdictions. So after our disaster, the CDBG allocations did not go through the state. They came directly from the feds to local jurisdictions. All of them, of course, were CDBG entitlement jurisdictions, so they had experience. But that was a very different path for those monies than what happened when the Biden administration came in, and all of a sudden the policy was to send those CDBG-DR monies to the state so that the state would then distribute them. The state of California, which has a propensity to be overbearing, they hijacked the program. And they blew us up. So the state has been an obstacle. And I say all this because I'm really glad that your state CDBG officer is here, because the lesson learned is not to goober up a disaster response program with a whole lot of other state expectations relative to, in California's example, homelessness and disabled people. They're asking us to house them first before disaster survivors. We consider that abusive. And an overreach on the part of the government. So our encouragement is to really have the state position itself as a pass-through. You want those monies as fast as you can. Yeah, 3 years later, but at the same time, you're trying not to have this thing all goobered up.
Thank you.
I remembered my thought, which was DR is interesting and very unique in that you can use DR funding as your local match for another federal or state grant.
Yes.
So that is a real unicorn situation. What that often means for DR recipients is often DR funding will pay for the local match for FEMA's PA and HMGP projects.
And as public assistance recipients,
Yes, that's where I was leading with that, is that this could be your skin in the game to something larger. So keeping those things in mind too, in terms of the 3 projects to always have at the top of the head in terms of needs.
And so we're actually going to skip ahead and continue on federal recovery resources, and then we'll come back to just closing out when it comes to those external partnerships, because I want to get a little bit more into what these look like. I think we're on the right train of thought right now. So if you want to go ahead. let's talk a little bit more about the disaster declaration types for wildfires specifically. And I'm going to start with Trevor, if he's willing to take that first pass.
Sure, yeah. So, and I'll just kind of speak broadly. This will all tie back to wildfires, but it's kind of applicable, except for FMAG, to everything, right? The first sort of grant program that FEMA runs when there's a wildfire that exceeds the capacity of the state well, when the fiscal capacity of the state looks like it's in jeopardy, it's the Fire Management Assistance Grant Program. That's a program that's declared locally. It's declared by the regional administrator. It's the only FEMA declaration that's not declared by the president. And that's done, and Joel maybe want to talk about how this looks from the state, but essentially what we're looking at is if that fire is left unchecked or unsuppressed or unmanaged, would the destruction caused by that incident reach the level of a major disaster declaration? So as we sort of gather information after a request for a fire management assistance grant, we look at what that outlook for that fire looks like, what the values at risk it's threatening are, the homes and the infrastructure that it might destroy, and if those look like a major disaster would ensue, the regional administrator will declare fire management assistance. Fire management assistance covers two kind of categories of work. It covers a limited set of Category B measures dealing directly with the management suppression of the fire, and then or mitigation against the effects of an emergency protection measures pursuant to a fire. And then Category 8, is it, man, getting rusty. Category H, which is the direct costs for managing, suppressing, and containing a fire. Joel, do you have anything to
Yeah, so
add there?
I mean, we talked about this briefly yesterday, a little bit touched on it as we're talking about the mitigation side. Sorry. So in the state, so right now in every jurisdiction, we're talking about thresholds a little bit yesterday for different disasters. So we have the same kind of threshold, and this, our focus is what's the likelihood it will become an I8 plus disaster, and that's 150, 182 homes. It's set kind of annually, and so I'm not sure what this year's numbers are as we get ready for this fire season. So that's that kind of target. And my team, working with the locals, working with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, we're tracking all the fire impacts and where it's at and where it's going. The big things, it has to be uncontrolled, generally uncontrolled. And you have to have houses. So 152, I think, was our kind of our target number last year, is because we're looking at it. And then you add in any like critical infrastructure that's applied. We had a fire in Lynn a couple years ago where not a lot of homes, but the largest solar farm in the state was in the path of the fire. So that was kind of a critical infrastructure element that added to our request. And then again, we present our report to the FEMA region, and then they decide is declared. So again, it's really about like looking at households. We count rooftops on that process to kind of get after that. But again, that only covers like kind of the fire suppression. So a lot of the money goes to the local fire departments to like, hey, to pay for the water they use. So that's an eligible cost, the fuel, the staff. Because a lot of these, a lot of your voluntary fire departments, they don't have a lot of funding. It really supports them during fire season. That's kind of the, and then the administration of those funds. It does give us that. We talked about yesterday the mitigation funds. We'll get a rate last year was about $1 million per FMAG declaration that can go back into the communities for mitigation activities, so we can improve the emergency generation of that fire of one of those remote fire stations. We can help them get new equipment and improve different things in that process.
And I think something that you're going to hear, or that I'm always very cognizant of, that when you hear a presidential declaration, is ask what that covers. And so, Trevor, do you want to get into that? Because you can easily hear presidential declaration and you're going to get nothing. Because it's there for the state, or it's there just for firefighting activities, or...
Yeah, so, right, like specifically kind of in the case of FMAGs, it's really just for managing the immediate suppression of the fire and the protective measures you have to take as a direct consequence of the fire. There's also, so broadly speaking, and I'm not quite sure how to approach this answer, because this is a kind of a big, can get to be kind of a weedy question, right? But there are two big FEMA direct programs of assistance that operate after a disaster. 3 if you include HMGP, which kind of comes along later. But there's individual assistance. Individual assistance is cash assistance dispersed directly from the federal government to an individual or a survivor household. and that covers real property losses, personal property losses, some rental assistance, some assistance for kind of meeting unmet needs directly in the aftermath of disaster, replacement of some effects and goods. There's the public assistance program. The public assistance program is eligible for state, local, tribal, territorial governments and some private nonprofits or some non-governmental organizations. Public assistance is broken down into 2 big buckets and 7 small buckets. The two big buckets are emergency work. Emergency work is debris removal. That's clearing debris generally from publicly owned infrastructure, roads, trails, the sites of municipal buildings that might have been impacted. Category B is the sort of goofiest category. It's called emergency protective measures, and that's actions taken to maintain life safety, protect public health, and protect damage to improve property in cost-effective ways in the immediate aftermath of an event up to 5 years. And then there's permanent work, categories C through G, and that's really the sort of nuts and bolts public assistance program that restores infrastructure back to its pre-disaster condition with mitigation. Declarations are made for like subsets of these things, though, frequently. Like emergency declarations, you'll see frequently will be for direct federal assistance only, for instance. And direct federal assistance is like when a jurisdiction is so overwhelmed and when a problem is of such scale and magnitude that only mobilizing the resources of the federal government can address that problem substantially and quickly.
I think we see the National Guard a lot. That's a way that can be utilized.
Yeah, that can be utilized, or I think sometimes folks from, incident management teams from other federal agencies, wildfire capabilities. We really don't use direct federal assistance a lot. It's a little slower than we'd like much of the time because it requires FEMA to tell another federal agency to do something. They notionally have to agree, but they don't always have to agree, and then we have to figure out what they're allowed to do, what they can do, and then how to pay them. And so it really is, most beneficial for like really enormous problems that require sort of huge mobilization of people and equipment and technical skills. Sometimes you'll see declarations that are DFA in Category B only, limited to sheltering and mass care. You'll see that in hurricane states really frequently, I'm sure.
Too often.
Fred's familiar with that, where, if a state is in the impact cone of a hurricane, we'll do a pre-disaster emergency declaration for DFA and sheltering to allow the mobilization of people outside of the impact area to safer locations. And then in public assistance expedited situations, you'll see, Category B or Category A and B turned on until we can do a preliminary damage assessment with the state to turn on permanent work. So a presidential declaration is kind of a many splendored thing, right? It covers from a very narrow set of activities to a pretty full spectrum of assisting individuals and jurisdictions, but it is important to know kind of what you're getting and talk to your FEMA, sort of colleagues or counterparts and your colleagues and counterparts at the state about what assistance is being provided.
Joel, anything to add there? Okay.
I know we talked about this some yesterday about the different the programs, so.
Okay.
Read the fine print.
And so do you want
Yeah.
to touch a little bit on hazard mitigation just in general, what that looks like?
Yeah, so I'll preface this to you by saying that's a whole nother division that runs the hazard mitigation grant program, so I don't like to talk about it too much. Joel actually, I think, runs it at the state, so he might be better to talk about that.
So yeah, I used to run it at the state until like about 2 months ago. So
Oh, okay.
as we
Hold on. I think we're also trying to clarify. What questions do you have?
Sorry.
Sorry, I might have just missed it, but when you talk about ask what the presidential declaration covers, who am I asking? Is that state EM?
You
or
could
is it-
ask your county EM even.
Okay, cool.
I mean, that's something that just make sure that when you hear it, that if they say, oh, presidentially declared disaster, what does that mean? Are there resources at the local level? Is it just at the state level? But you can ask your county EM that. It's also available on FEMA's website of what that is. you could probably, depending on for Paradise at that time, you probably could have Googled Paradise Disaster Declaration FEMA, and it usually gets you pretty close to the right website. But just making sure that you understand what's currently being covered. But your county would probably be someone you could ask that as well.
But for several of you in this room, we just recently got a declaration for the January storms for public assistance. So if your county is on that list, there's 16 of them, and say most of the peninsula was covered down into the Columbia area. So if you're in one of those counties, talk to your EMs and talk to your local authorities to be like, hey. And specifically, if you had damages from that time frame, that was 5 to 29 January. So if you had damages related to that freeze and the winter storms we had, start having those conversations now because you might be eligible for some reimbursement. That's kind of what it is when you hear of a declaration and it affects your jurisdiction, ask the question, hey, what information? What is this for? And if you do apply, if you have damages that apply for that or individual affected, okay, what do you need from me to move forward with this or help?
So this is great. Disaster happened in January. We're finally, after going back and forth and proving that we met the threshold, got a disaster declaration now, real time for 14 counties in Washington. Hey guys, we just heard that money got turned on. So like, these are the things to be asking questions on. I'm probably saying it, making FEMA cringe right now, but it's the way I say it. But it might also be like, don't go into this of I'm not eligible. You are an eligible entity. Have the conversation, submit your what's called a request for public assistance.
And that window is currently open. So if you are, and even if you don't know what it is, request public assistance, and then that opens this up for my team to look at your damages and do they qualify? Do you meet all the requirements? Just because you request doesn't mean you'll get it. We have to go through the checks and balances process, but if you're unsure, talk to your EMs, and then you can always apply, and then my team can look at your situation and say, okay, yes, you do qualify, and these are the costs that are eligible, or these are the projects you can get after for repair, and go from there.
And what's the minimum threshold currently for projects? In order
32,000, I thought,
3,200?
Yeah, it's like 3,200 and change,
Oh,
somewhere right around there, yeah.
So 3,300 is not all, I know for some people that can be a lot, some not as much, but that's all the costs you have to incur to be eligible for a project. So what happens if during that freeze, you had your staff working overtime and you were paying that overtime? That could be an eligible expense. And so as long as they followed your pay policy, but if you have whatever that OT looks like, that's an eligible expense that may have happened in January.
And then you might have made, in some of your facilities, you might have made temporary repairs at the time, those are eligible. But you're just like, hey, I still have to do permanent repair. You know what I mean? Because maybe you haven't got there to some of the damages, and that's when then we work out the projects. What does permanent repair look like? We work that through to get it approved, meet all the qualifications, and then the funding is available for you to do those permanent repairs.
Debris removal if you had a lot of limbs fall. So, any other questions?
Can I clarify that it's my understanding that our CDM is supposed to be contacting us during these? So like the ice storm, like I had staff working overtime. I had flooded units that I had to repair. I think that's right, but we're not, are the cool kids.
I'm sorry, I tried.
So because I would probably be the person that would talk to them, wanting to know about the details on the actual work on the properties. Do they contact you, or if they are not contacting me, do I contact the Washington Emergency Management Division?
So we generally say start your local, but if you're not getting information, we're here to assist and make those connections. Maybe you don't have the
frog and like
Yeah.
make anyone angry, but
So for your jurisdiction, we talked yesterday on break that you guys aren't eligible, but in the future, so usually we will, hey, you've been declared, it goes out, and we work with the EMs and the other applicants in this time frame to, hey, if you have damages, apply and get people in. And it's sort of the process, and we realized with the last disaster, oh, this person didn't even realize they're eligible entity. We weren't tracking them, and we can request a late addition, and then we walk through that process. So a lot of it's based on where you're located. Your county wasn't declared, so it gives us some problems there. But if you are in a county that was declared, if you haven't seen traffic on it, reach out, because sometimes EMs don't know who you, because we're talking about communications and connections. they don't know that you are an eligible applicant. And they say, they think of you, you're HUD funded, this federal, you're not eligible for this stuff. Well, there is some eligibility there for the stuff you guys do. Some of it's your EM's knowledge of what you do and what kind of entity you are. And I saw that in Spokane recently. We did an RPA, and they're like, so-and-so didn't apply. And then County EM was like, I didn't reach out to them because I didn't realize that, yes, they are an eligible applicant, so we were able to reach out and get them. So some of that's that knowledge base, and it goes back to those connections and making sure they know who you are and what your kind of programs are, so they can help educate you as new opportunities come out as well.
So, he mentioned RPA, request for public assistance. I always advise folks after a disaster, make the request, get it in, because there's a cutoff that the state is going to have. It's better to have it in, it's better to have and not need, and to need and not have, right? So fill out, it's just a one-page form that you have to fill out and send into.
Well, actually now it's all in FEMA grants portal, so they
Okay.
actually can register now for an account, and then with the counties that they're,
Beautiful.
and then they would be notified of any open RP or any opportunities to submit an RPA, that they would be declared for their county.
But if you don't have grants portal, like say time now, and you want to get in, you can always reach out to my team, and we'll assist you in getting on the grants portal, and then also get you your IPA submitted through the portal.
So, and I'm going to make a pitch on Joel's beat. Usually it's Joel telling someone that I'm going to do something, but this is nice for me. Right, this is when you have disaster-related impacts, tell your county emergency manager, because the state, if there is enough stuff going on in the state, if they see that at the state EOC, right, that's where the declaration process begins. It begins with individual eligible applicants telling their county emergency manager, hey, we have damage to our facilities, or we have people who are being displaced from their homes. That informs the initial, and right, I mean,
I just never even thought to be like, hey, because I figured everybody else is flooded.
yeah,
Because they're
no,
all flooded,
like,
you might be able to get a declaration.
you're right, yeah, the more people are flooded,
That I never realized that. 'Cause
right.
I think of Katrina, that's a disaster. The
So,
fire is a disaster.
yeah,
My unit's flooding is my life in winter.
right, all you know, again, there are, right, we do have a bunch of declaration factors that we assess when we're looking at preliminary damage assessments, but the fuller picture that the state has for us when we go work with them to do the joint preliminary damage assessment process, the better able we are to articulate the unmet needs in the state, and the fact that the state's capacity is overwhelmed, right? So
You exceed that threshold we were talking about yesterday.
yeah, and I don't like to. So right, no one at FEMA will ever actually tell you that there's a threshold, right? There are indicators, there are criteria, there are things that we assess, right? There's no threshold. Yeah. However, if you don't have at least $1.80, I think it's $1.88 per capita in your state of damages, and $3.90
And I think we're
or
still
so.
on like the 2010 census data.
No, we're on the 2020
Oh, we
census
made
data.
it,
Yep.
we switched over.
Yeah, right. So tell your county emergency managers, they'll talk with the state. That paints the full picture of the damages and the needs in a state, and that's how FEMA programs get turned on. So if you're not, and you know, county emergency managers, I've met a lot of them, and they are like, sometimes it's one person 50% of the time in small counties. You know, they got a lot to do. They might not be able to reach out to every potentially affected recipient. There's going to be a ton they don't know about. Be affirmative in your outreach there. If you're not getting a hold of them, you know, talk to Joel and his team. But without doing that, the state can't come to my team to say, hey, let's take a look at this for a potential declaration.
And before we move on to Ed, Trevor, one other thing is communication to your residents to call and also register after the disaster, because those numbers for IA.
Yeah, when IA is turned on, there's there's a few ways, right? There's a mobile app that FEMA has that's actually pretty good. That's where we receive the majority of our registrations now. We have a website that you can register on. I think between the app and the website, that accounts for something like 80 to 85% of our registrations now. And then there's the phone number, which embarrassingly I can't remember off the top of my head, but it is like something like 1-800-CALL-FEMA or something.
Yeah.
It's super easy. I'm blanking right now.
And for an advocation purpose, you could try and have them call ahead of the declaration just to show the need, which also helps the state's case.
Yeah.
FEMA won't say that.
1-800-621-3362.
Thank you, Joel.
621 FEMA.
Yeah, but no, I think that's important, that there's multiple ways to be advocating in that response to recovery phase. So Ed, I know you have a couple comments.
What,
Yeah, just very quickly, and Fred, maybe you can help
Yeah,
back me up
yeah.
on one of these. But first of all, I believe, and I'm really glad I came here, I'm learning a lot about FEMA and disaster recovery, and
So do you have some best practices and lessons learned?
I'm chagrined to admit that our agency probably has missed out on $3 or $4 million worth of reimbursements. I just learned today. Not happy, because we never knew to reach out to a FEMA coordinator or a state coordinator.
Mm-hmm.
They kept approaching us, asking for us for information, assuming we're a HUD-funded agency and everything's cool. We got millions of dollars out there, and we've missed the boat. And so, the lesson learned: know your FEMA people, know your state emergency manager is really important, and reach out to them right away and keep notes. I mean, this is really important. Second, not all presidential declarations are the same, we've learned. And in the Camp Fire disaster, we had a particular presidential declaration that I think was a bit vindictive because it didn't include everything we needed. And Fred, you and I have talked about this, that you're subject to politics in these declarations. And based on the type of declaration, and I don't know enough about the specifics, we missed out on a lot of recovery opportunity in our community, and it was simply politics. The current administration in Washington versus the administration in California. Fred, can you talk a little bit about these presidential declarations and the discretion and the politics in there?
So, yeah.
Within reason.
My goldfish is on fire.
Sorry, Felicia and Dan.
Let me just say, part of the challenge with the campfire, because I was there, was that there were people in leadership who were going around and saying HUD will take care of that. In the weeks following a fire, and it was a huge frustration of mine, and so it's why potentially you all missed opportunities, because there was this bias, misconception that's there, and so that's why I encourage you all to sort of check that if someone is saying it. Same thing, your residents, as I said yesterday, are citizens of the United States. They're eligible for everything that everybody else who's in the impacted area is eligible for. Encourage them to apply so that they can get assistance if it's needed. So yes, I'll tell you personally a story. So there was I think it was like 2011, really bad floods in Tennessee and some other place. And the amount of money that Congress appropriated was it was less than 20 million, right? And it was for all disasters in that year. And so we had to sit there and figure out how to divide between all disasters, like which places were most impacted. And so we did, and nobody was happy because nobody got enough money, right? Well, we kept going back to Congress in subsequent years and saying, okay, you want to do an appropriation for these disasters, but remember that when you're realizing, can we give them some more money? Can we do a bigger appropriation, give us a lot of money, and let us include those other places? And so Congress did, still not enough. And we had to make decisions. And I remember after we made our allocation decision, made recommendations to the secretary, you could do it this way, you could do it this way, you can count these unmet needs over these, so on. There's a lot of variability. Congress says unmet needs, and the secretary gets to determine how and what unmet needs get prioritized. That's where the political stuff comes in. I was not being political in my recommendations, I can guarantee you all, but I did have a bias, and this is where the bias comes in, right? There was a staffer in our Congressional and Intergovernmental Relations office who she said to me, she said, man, if I ever go back up on the Hill, I'm going to tell my member to just call. And I said, well, why? She said, Fred, you left, I hope I don't offend anybody, you left North Carolina off just because they never called us. And I realized that she was right. Nobody from North Carolina ever called and bugged me about, when are we going to get CDBG-DR money? And so we had a discretion. We could draw the line at 12 million or at 15 million. I said, let's do it at 15 million because everybody else who was beneath that, we can take their money and plus up everybody above the line, right? And so it wasn't really a political decision, but it was motivated by politics, by who was calling and making the demand. And so that's why, what Brittany was saying about talking to your congressional leaders, letting them know you have these needs, giving them the talking points, what to ask for, what your needs are, so that they can be explicit about that, and that when those decisions are made, that some staffer who's just sitting around making recommendations to his or her boss doesn't leave you all out because they hadn't heard from anyone from your state or your community.
Thank you.
Sorry, North Carolina.
Any questions, comments?
And subsequently, 20 years from now, is it worth it for me?
So Trevor, if we have someone that's eligible that can easily meet the small project threshold of that $3,300, how bad is the administrative burden, and in hindsight, will it be worth it?
So, yeah, I'm not going to tell you whether or not that's worth it for you, right? That's not my place. We can make the assistance available. I can tell you that it's not it's not as easy as we'd like it to be. We would love it if the program were easier and we require fewer documents. There's a couple, there's a real unique feature of the public assistance program is that it's an open-ended commitment to the federal government. So it's not like a block of money. There's not $10 million for public assistance for a disaster. Public assistance funds 75% of the cost to repair all of the eligible infrastructure in declared areas without limit. It's funded from the disaster relief fund. And what that means is that, the GAO and DHS, IG like our oversight of that program to be pretty rigorous because there's no limit to the potential obligation of the government. So, would I love to be able to show up and say, yep, here's a check for $3,500. It's not much money. It's not much risk. Yeah, that's like my ideal implementation of the PA program for small projects. The small project threshold, all projects under $1 million now are small projects. And those require less documentation, but they carry some risks of, you get one bite at the apple, we agree on an estimate. FEMA funds that if you come in over the estimate, there's a long procedure with a really tight timeline to try and get more money out of FEMA. So I'm not going to sit up here and say, hey, it's super easy to get $3,500 from FEMA. It's as easy at $3,500 from FEMA approximately as it is to get $900,000 from FEMA, which is to say, But
what I think is really important for this is that a lot of it is if it's already work that's been done or the costs have already been incurred, you just have to be able to provide the documentation to be able to substantiate that you incurred those costs. and that it's within the confines of your policies and procedures. So when we talked about data and we talked about the importance of having your continuity plan and all your policies and procedures, one of those would be your pay policy. So if you had overtime, you're able to show to FEMA, hey, this is my pay policy, and here is the timesheets showing that these personnel worked outside of that, and so I did have to pay additional or whatever else that looks like. And then here's the payroll showing I paid them. That would be what would be required, high level for the most part, but that's the high level of like what would be required. And as long as FEMA understands and can see that, especially from that 35 to under $1 million threshold, it's almost like a block grant in a sense of the fact that if they agree and that's awarded, that's like they're going to issue that to you and it goes to the state. I'm not familiar with the state of Washington, so.
And that's another important point, and I'll let Joel cut in here a bit, right? FEMA obligates money, and what that does is sort of it makes that money available to the state to disperse. The state disperses the money, right? Everyone, all subdivisions of the state and all private nonprofits are applicants to the state's program. And the state may have its own requirements to disperse money that are separate from FEMA's requirements.
As we heard from Ed about CDBG-DR.
Yeah, and so we do at the state, we're the recipient of PA funds, and then all of you, if you were applied, would be our sub-recipients or applicants. One benefit to that, I mean, we might add a little bit on there, but the state generally, based on every disaster and legislative approval at the state level, is we share a cost match. So the FEMA will cover 75% of a given repair. The state will kick in 12.5%. So we'll kick in 10. So it decreases what the local need for cost match is. So that's kind of the, hey, we might have some stipulations, but we're going to cover some of that cost. And most of our stuff is pretty streamlined with FEMA system. We try to streamline it as where we can. But we have our own auditor to answer, state auditor to answer to, and all of that. And then there are state requirements that FEMA doesn't have that we might have to meet. So.
And sort of one more thing on that too is that FEMA does make an administrative entitlement available as part of the public assistance program to cover some of the cost of working through the PA process. I think that's for applicants. I think that's 7. It's either 5 or 7%.
It's 12% of the award, 7% generally for state administration, and then 5% for the locals.
Translation, you can hire a consultant to help you.
Or pay one of your staff to do that outside of the current fund. So it could be additional funds for your staff or bring in a consultant that might be able to navigate the program.
Yeah. Some jurisdictions will hire somebody part-time to take care of this specifically, have experience within their community, and that's what we push. Hey, if you have someone in your community who has any kind of public assistance, hire them on part-time. Those costs are eligible, and then you're building kind of resiliency within like the county or your organization.
I saw other questions. Yes.
Clarification, about CDBG-DR, is the allocation from Congress have to be that specific disaster, or is it allocation in general for HUD, or does it vary depending on which
It varies, but generally what I've seen Congress do is say, this is for major disasters and major and catastrophic disasters from this time period to this time period. Maybe for a particular calendar year, it may cover years. And so honestly, I've consulted to governors following disasters, and the first thing I tell them to do is call these states, talk to these governors. You all need to go to Washington together, right? Like bipartisan trip to Washington, hand in hand. We need money, right? And that, yeah. So that's it. And so you go back to as far as the last disaster CDBG declaration was, and say see everybody who had a major disaster, and try to get them on board with getting an appropriation from Congress.
Any additional questions? Yes. So for RPAs or request for public assistance, can you request it for commercial spaces as well?
So we go back to legal authority responsibility. So depends on, like, is this like lease space? You're talking about the lease spaces? Oh, where they were relocated to. So the cost for relocation, like if you had the temporary for relocation, I believe those would be, everything's very specific, I have to look at that, but the cost incurred when you had to relocate could be eligible. But repairs of like a lease facility really we have to look at the lease agreement and if you have responsibility to repair damage versus the leasee.
You'll hear a lot about legal responsibility. So even when it comes to if any of you do any P3 or public-private partnerships, it would be looking at that agreement to see what the PHA specifically is legally responsible for. If you are not responsible for maintenance or repairs, if you're in that, if you're renting a place, same thing, legal responsibility.
Yeah, and it's actually a little tighter than that too. If the relocation is not done for the purposes of protecting public health and safety or to save lives or to protect improved property in a cost-effective fashion, it's not likely to be eligible, right? So a bit like generally kind of business continuity type expenses or revenue-related expenses are not eligible for public assistance.
So I think the biggest thing we talk about that is if you got damage doing the RPA, because it is a lot of look in and we have to get down to the specifics of time frames and locations and all the legal responsibilities. So it is a deep dive process. So like it's hard to say like in general, yes, this is eligible or not because everybody's situation is different. So but do the RPA and let's have that conversation and look at the paperwork.
Yeah, right. It's our job is to sort of work with the state. We assign program delivery managers who are and task force leads who are sort of experts at the PA program, and they'll tell you, right? I'll sit up here and I can speculate about stuff all day. There's only really one eligibility decision I ever give on the spot, and that's about local authorities giving cash to people. But that's not eligible. Right, but the rest of it really does rely heavily on the specifics of your agreements with tenants on what actions were taken and the reasons for those actions, and how those comport with our eligibility requirements.
And sometimes it's mitigation. So again, we're talking about earthquakes, we're talking about wildfires. It might be, I'm not going to rebuild that, but when it comes to clearing and some of that demolition can potentially be eligible. Again, we're talking in hypotheticals. It is situation specific, but there is a lot of opportunity. So to Joel's point, if you're ever impacted by an event and you're eligible to submit an RPA, have the conversation. You can also choose to withdraw the RPA and say, thanks, but no thanks. That sounds like a lift and I have enough on my plate. But there's having the conversation first to find out that your staff time's eligible, or you want to turn that now into green space because of the frustrations. You can also take those funds potentially for what you would have rebuilt and turn it into an alternative project and use it for something else that you need. So if in Ed's case, I think he's shaking his head because he's like all the things I didn't know. But in Ed's case, if he said, I do not want to build a facility back there, but I would like to add additional units over here, and if it's all eligible and he's navigated the process, that's a potential. So there's a lot of opportunity and innovation. I will honestly, truly commend FEMA. In the past 5 years, I've been working in the DR space, almost 10 years. But in the past, even really 3 years, FEMA has made significant strides for agility and innovation in their funding and their programs. You just have to have the conversation first, or you wouldn't know that.
Sorry.
See, it was a positive thing, Trevor. Aren't you glad you came?
No, I mean, I'm not trying to follow up good news. Right, we have been working diligently as an agency to make sure that we are implementing our program in a way that better meets the needs of communities and survivors. Right, most recently in IA, our regulatory changes there were sweeping and constituted a really substantial reform to that program. In PA, it's a little sort of more tinkering at the margins, but talk to, if you're an applicant for the program, talk to the FEMA folks and the state folks that come out and talk to you and tell them, right, the baseline is always what's the cost to restore your facilities to their pre-disaster condition, but tell them what you actually want as a community or as an entity or as a jurisdiction. And, I can't sit here and say, hey, they'll always find a way to get you there. But they might get you closer than you might think, right? We have a good amount of mitigation that we can do and a good amount of flexibility in the way we implement our program.
So,
I'm saying good things about FEMA. So, listen, there are incredibly dedicated public servants who work for FEMA under a lot of pressure, and they run towards bad things and not from them. For the most part, they are doing the best they can. The truth of the matter is that sometimes public servants, all of us, confuse what is a practice or a policy with the law. So they'll say you can't do that, that the program doesn't allow it. And we'll say it relies on statute. Well, it may not be statute. It may be an interpretation of statute that went into regulations that then was put into some policy guidance that then was interpreted by some senior manager for practice purposes. And so you have that, right? So when somebody tells you it's the law, get your lawyer to look it up to make sure that's the case. And then Joe said something to me during the break. I said, sometimes there are folks at FEMA who you would think that the money that disaster survivors in the communities looking for is coming out of their kids' college fund or their own retirement fund, right? And he said that some senior manager, was it you or he?
No, it's Frank Richanga, who's currently the Director of Individual Assistance in the Recovery Directorate.
Yeah.
And Frank,
I'll let you say
yeah,
it.
thanks. I worked with Frank pretty extensively when I was deployed to Hurricane Harvey. He was working in public assistance at the time, and he said, hey, our job is not to stand in front of this money. Our job is to stand next to the money, right? It's to stand next to the money and make sure that people get the right amount of money, which is always as much money as that we can give them, given our statutes, regulations, and policies.
But this is the thing. They get beat up on. There are people in the IG and the Inspector General's office and the GAO's office who just love to find where a dedicated public servant made a mistake. And so what it produces sometimes is, at the senior level, this risk aversion. Like, we've got to tighten up all of this around, and so there is the pendulum swinging the other way after someone has made an error. And here's the thing, an error interpretation, when you have a really huge disaster, can be into the billions of dollars, right? So that's the thing. And so being fair to FEMA, right? They're trying to make sure they don't have that thing where they get beat up on and they end up costing the federal government billions of dollars and somebody loses their job over it, really. And so that's what you're up against, but know you're going to be up against it and push back, because really, some things that are just practices, people will say is the law. Like, Congress handed this down, and there's no way we can deviate from this.
So Fred, just to close out our federal resources, I'd love to kick to Joel as well to see for Washington or the Pacific Northwest in general. But can you touch on SBA, or the Small Business Administration, in that declaration?
Sure. So there are a few ways. People say SBA disaster, like why are they here? Well, interestingly enough, SBA for housing has a pretty big authority in a declared disaster. They can provide loans to disaster-impacted homeowners. So that's one way in your community. I'm telling you more
So
broadly.
like the landlords, definitely.
No.
Okay.
So it depends on how big the landlord is, right?
Yeah.
So if they're big enough to be regarded as a small business, right? So they do have loans for small businesses. And, so your mom and pop landlord with 1 or 2 units, they're caught in the middle, right? They're too big, too small to be involved. But, if it is an owner-occupied unit, they may qualify under the homeowner program. But your larger, you asking a question, I think earlier about someone over on that side, about a place that's owned by a private developer in partnership with the housing authority. That private developer may be eligible for a low-interest small business loan, a small business administration loan.
And
so
we're usually talking like less than 2%, I believe.
It's really cheap money nowadays, right? Compared with, so it's good. At one point, it wasn't as good when the interest rates were a lot lower, but right now it's really, really cheap money. And so there's this bias. Folks like, I don't need another loan. I can't, but it's cheap money. And sometimes I don't want to be like somebody saying that HUD's going to come in and save you and when you're not. But sometimes, surprisingly, Congress acts and they actually waive and forgive those SBA. I've seen it only rarely. Don't depend on that. But if it's a big enough disaster, things happen. Yeah.
COVID, there was some forgiving for the SBA loans.
Yeah. And so I'll piggyback on that. So we've been doing a lot of SBA rollout in Spokane. Specifically to note is for those individuals that need that loan, they don't pay it back till their work's done. So if it's a rebuild or repair or something like that, so the interest rate and the payments aren't required until you've at least a year out, and that can be extended based on the length of time for you to be basically back in a stable environment. And it's tailorable too. You could get approved for $300,000. An individual could be approved for $300,000, but as they start to go, maybe I only need $200,000 for this repair, and then they can scale that, and it's long-term loans. There's what Lisa just had there too. But also it's gap too. So somebody, maybe they have a limit of their funds. So maybe somebody was insured for, we're talking about SRP, a lot of people are underinsured. Somebody's insured for $500,000, but the repair cost is going to be $800,000 to rebuild and actually get a new home, and especially in a wildfire. Well, that loan can cover some of that gap, and then you can get loan maybe initially out to the whole extent based on insurance, and they'll work with you on, hey, what insurance is going to cover when they make their funds available to fill your gaps and needs when you need it. So there's a lot there, but the SBA have their great reps, and so if you have any questions, reach out to your local SBA rep, and they can unpack this whole program for you in detail.
One of the things that Trevor and I talked about during the break, he alluded to the regulation change on the IA side. There had been, this is where there was a misinterpretation of policy, I believe. There had been this practice at FEMA that if you got an SBA loan, that you weren't eligible for any additional FEMA individual assistance. Well, I think that's a misinterpretation of the law, and I think that that's reflected in some of the policy changes that they're having. They're saying that if after you go look at your insurance says this is what you're eligible for, there's still a gap, that $500,000 versus the $800,000 to build back, then potentially you can go back to FEMA, or you should go back to FEMA and get them to analyze whether you are eligible for more in individual assistance. So that could defray the amount of the SBA loan you have to take because you get more in grant.
Thank you. Any questions? Any questions from online with Zoom? All right, so now we're going to close out with local resources. Let's go back a couple slides. We skipped around a little bit just based on the good conversation.
Can I
Yes.
say something about waivers?
Yes, that is on the list.
Okay,
But,
all right.
Ed,
Yeah, I have waivers to talk about, but I was just going to jump into this idea of, or where are we going here? What was the last, where did we leave off? I'm sorry.
SBA loans.
SBA loans, no, that wasn't it.
Well, let's give Fred a minute.
Continue.
Let's talk about disaster waivers and emergency procurement, Ed, or Fred.
Yeah. And so, first of all, Felicia mentioned yesterday that on HUD's website, there are some really great fact sheets. I would draw your attention for information on the waivers to the fact sheets, because there are a whole lot of them, and some of them I don't know as well as others, but you got a place that burned down. It's not a good time for HUD to come out and do a physical inspection, right? So you can get a waiver of your physical inspection. You lost, what percent of your voucher units?
15%.
15% of your voucher units. Not a good time to score you on your CMAP usage, right? On your usage and get a CMAP score. So those are things that can be waived and extended, sometimes even past your initial waiver. Talk to your local field office. This is where having that relationship with the people in the back of the room is important, because not only can they help you to understand how to go about applying for those waivers, but they will be the ones advocating for you to their headquarters office to get those waivers, because they'll be on the ground, they'll see what's going on and understand and be able to articulate on your behalf what the needs are. Emergency procurement, one of the places where housing authorities often get themselves in trouble, right, is on procurement, not following the rules. HUD recognizes, as does FEMA, that, in a disaster, sometimes you just don't have the time to go through the long, drawn-out process. And so there are emergency procurement regulations in the disaster context. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to say have your procurement specialist, your attorney, to review those and see what's eligible. I don't want to get anybody in trouble by being, I'm not a procurement specialist and I don't want to advise you on procurement, but just know that there are opportunities out there for you to address. You've got a damaged septic system that you have to repair, and you can't go through a 3-month procurement process. You got to get it fixed right away. There are ways to do that on an expedited basis using the regulations that HUD has, recognizing that in a disaster, things have to happen expeditiously.
And there's resources out there. So again, you can Google FEMA Procurement Disaster Assistance Training, or FEMA PDAT is a great resource that they have trainings and resources about how to procure, especially the difference between like emergency procurement and regular procurement as far as emergent and exigent circumstances. I would really implore everyone to be aware of the FEMA PDAT. Even for your normal blue sky day procurement, there's other resources just about the requirements of procurement that I would really implore. I know you probably have a really good friend, Joe, who handles some of your repairs in the day-to-day, but there's going to be a lot more cost, and if you want that to be federally reimbursed, you need to make sure that you have properly procured Joe, you've gotten the estimates, or you can also let him know that he has the opportunity to respond based on how you build out your procurement, as long as it's in confines with the regulations.
Yeah, the environmental regulations, those, like, you're not going to get a whole lot of leeway on. So recognize that if you're, having to repair something, and so again, get your procurement specialist to not only, especially if you fill out your RPA and you want to get FEMA to pay for your 25% match. You want FEMA to pay for 75%, and you pay for the 25% on whatever those costs are that you have. Look at FEMA's procurement requirements and look at HUD's procurement requirements, and make sure that you're meeting both of those.
Thank you. Any questions?
If I can add,
Yes.
Regarding waivers, so our Section 8 program was impacted. Waivers was a very important subject early on. Our field office, HUD field office, kept asking us, what waivers do you want? We had no idea what waivers to ask for. We wanted waivers from everything, really. But what we ended up doing, we found HUD resources across the land. I don't know if you recall yesterday, I said we received visitors from almost every HUD office in the land. But amongst them were a couple of individuals we were turned on to who actually knew about the subject of waivers and what might be appropriate under the circumstances. So we give great credit to Rob Nelson of the HUD Oklahoma office and Tanya Bergen of the HUD Kansas City office, who suggested these waivers. We've got 3 waivers. We got a CMAP scoring forbearance waiver. We got a baseline calculation waiver. We asked to have our Section 8 appropriations just carried through, in terms of our HAP allocation until we could reestablish our program. We asked to deny any incoming portable vouchers. There was no housing in our jurisdiction, so we just said we're not accepting anybody from outside our jurisdiction. And we got all 3 of those waivers, and we worked with them for about 3 years. So HUD was very interested in the waiver process. It worked really well. And a couple takeaways. I can't overemphasize this. In looking back at the landscape of the last 5 years and our development opportunity in particular, creating new housing opportunity, if it weren't for the federal government, we would have no response at all. The plain and simple of it is, in rebuilding units, in our jurisdiction, it costs $425,000 a unit on average to build a unit under the tax credit program. We have a $1.3 billion investment in housing undergoing in our jurisdiction. But if it weren't for the CDBG-DR and low-income housing tax credit program, none of that would happen. The state had absolutely no resources to contribute. I don't know what it's like up here, but the reality, and I want to give kudos to the feds, if it weren't for the feds, we would not have disaster recovery in any way, shape, or form. And it really stands in bleak contrast to the state policy, which is completely absent. There is no coherent disaster response policy whatsoever. Hopefully Washington and Oregon and Idaho are in better shape. But this is really important that you're going to be relying on the federal government, these 2 principal sources of funds, CDBG-DR and low-income housing tax credits, because as you know, the only way we build new housing now is with low-income housing tax credits. Unless you are struck by lightning and you get a Section 202 or 811 allocation, you're not going to be building new housing without credits, or unless you've got huge piles of cash in your pocket. So you start with the credits and you backfill with CDBG-DR, and that's your path to housing opportunity. That's it. And you throw in some Section 8 vouchers, project-based them. Those are your tools to work forward.
Thank you. So I'd like to close it out just with external partnerships in general. We've really hit this home. I keep saying stakeholders. We talk about partnerships, both internal and external. But I think this is really important as you're walking away and thinking about the stakeholders and the relationships that you have now, the ones you should capitalize on and the ones you should be continuing to build. So having Trevor here, I think, is really helpful for this piece as well, because talking about how VOADs are part of your community and how they can come in, I'm interested in hearing Trevor's experience across the Pacific Northwest in general, and then even a little bit from Joel of what he's seen at what VOADs have been active in this area and what that has even looked like.
Yeah, so in my individual assistance branch, we actually have a full-time voluntary agency liaison, and that's Chris Aronin. Chris's job is to make good connections with voluntary agencies, both at the national level, the national VOAD. So that was started, I did some homework on this and I'm like forgetting everything. There were originally 7 national agencies active in disaster. There's like something like 70 now, mostly faith-based organizations, but a lot of secular organizations as well. And those, right, the job of the voluntary agency liaison at the region is to connect those agencies with opportunities to assist communities that have been impacted by an incident, not even necessarily a declared disaster. And so they do that in a couple of ways. One, just directly finding somebody with a need and connecting them. But the real kind of leverage there, hopefully Joel will agree with me here, is they help stand up and facilitate and coordinate long-term recovery groups, generally at the county level, where individuals with unmet needs in the county can kind of work with a case manager or a community member to say, hey, here's the things that I'm left without after I've exhausted all of the available assistance that I'm aware of. And on the other side of the table are voluntary agencies that say, hey, right, like if you need lumber, just today, right, maybe not just today, but within the past week or so, we identified a source of donated lumber to build out the Connex boxes that Joel mentioned earlier up in Elk. That was the voluntary agency liaison connecting a donor who wanted to help out with the unmet need in the community through the long-term recovery group at the county level. And that's the real strength. So that's available generally, like that's always available under a Stafford Act declaration. It's sometimes available depending on capacity, and you know, we'd like to make it available as much as possible. It's just Chris. We can't always do everything, but Joel has, I think, a big capacity in the state of Washington. I think our partners up in Alaska certainly have a deep capacity, Idaho and Oregon as well, to help make those connections. And Chris on my team can work both at the Mountain West VOAD, National VOAD, and other VOAD agencies to kind of build those connections and connect the partners that we wouldn't ordinarily work with across the federal interagency to help survivors.
Yeah, so Trevor was right on point there with the assets, like the VOAs, what they bring to the table. And a long-term recovery group is something that most of you don't have. Spokane got one recently, and then we have some up in Whatcom and Skagit, from our kind of past IA disaster. But it doesn't have to be that IA disaster level. If it's a significant impact and you're going to have long-term recovery for individuals, that long-term recovery group is kind of what their focus is on. And when you stand them up, we have some experts in the state that are volunteers that come out and help the local jurisdictions establish those and run them full time. And like he said, Trevor said, it's all about as people come to the table, hey, I have donated items or equipment, or they can also solicit for needs, like, hey, because they're a nonprofit, so they go out and solicit for donations, like, hey, we have a huge need coming into the winter for shovels and ice, salt for the ice areas up in Spokane. That was one of the needs that came out. Like, hey, they asked me to stay. It's like, well, I can't really fund that. But they were able to reach out to different Lowe's, Home Depot, and they got a bunch of that stuff donated. And other organizations donated cash for purchases. So that's kind of what their goal. They feel that other needs assistance beyond everything else. But there are some, speaking of specific VOAs in the state, and maybe for you guys to consider that do good work. The Mennonites. I'm not sure if they come out, and if you provide the labor, they will provide. If you provide the materials, they will provide the labor and build homes for you. We have several being built in. Have several being built up in Malden. They've built some on there, continue to build. They're going to start building some in Spokane for the residents to get them homes to live in. They can do repairs as well versus whole home builds. Team Rubicon is very big when it comes to like debris management and muck and gut out of facilities if they're burnt or flooded, so they can come out.
I always laugh when I hear Team Rubicon because it's like they're really good at breaking things. I mean, they're a veteran-focused nonprofit, and so they love to come in and muck
as an
and
old
gut.
Army guy, we like the sledgehammer approach a lot of times.
So it's my favorite to talk about. Team Rubicon's amazing, but it's just funny because it's like, yeah, if you need a muck and gut, they will come in and rip everything out. But they come in structured. They're doing the appropriate approach.
Yeah.
It's just funny.
And then there are a lot out there, and that's like, so we have some people that do. I don't have a full-time voluntary agency liaison in my team, but we have people who do part-time, and also we're tied in with the state. State has a VOAD office, state VOAD, so they coordinate across the state different resources, and they are connected. Their whole goal is just to be connected with different organizations. So there's a lot to be done there.
Yeah, and 2020 Oregon wildfires. I was working in PA at the time, so had less kind of interface with this, but. After I moved up to be the acting individual assistance branch director about a year later, and actually had quite a bit of kind of reporting and oversight on long-term recovery groups, and they really did make a huge difference, right? When Oregon's direct housing program wound up, I think 2 years after it was implemented, every single person in that direct housing program had found a longer-term housing solution. That's a few hundred families, which is a lot in a historically tight housing market where there are essentially zero affordable starts being made. And that is largely due to the efforts and practices of the long-term recovery groups that connected people with opportunities. So I can't say enough about the importance at the county level of sort of moving in that direction, standing that up, participating in it to the extent you have a role, and helping the survivors.
Thank you. I think we've talked a lot about local resources and about local emergency management. Sorry, someone's cleaning the window. But I think, so I'm not going to hit home a little bit anymore when it comes to that local emergency management, but that's both your county level and your city level. So it's not just one or the other. Know who they both are. Understand what the plans look like for sheltering and transportation for your area. And assist, and you might be able to talk with your county to see what local resources are available, even those other organizations or nonprofits. So let's close out external partnerships with long-term housing. So what does that look like, Fred, as far as partnering with other PHAs, developing that rapport now, transferring residents, issuing vouchers?
Yeah, so you may have people who are fiercely tied to their homes, as most of us are. But the reality is the time frame to rebuild damaged housing may mean that the best solution for someone is to take a voucher and port someplace else, hopefully and potentially nearby. So there is that opportunity. You can work with your local HUD office. One of the things they start to do, day one after a disaster is try to identify if there are other available units someplace else. Still sister agency relationships talked about. You all, here in the room may say, you on the eastern side, we're on the western side, let's work together just in case the very worst happens, that you all have in your administrative plan to give priority to disaster victims so we can rehouse some of our people in your community while we're rebuilding housing. And then, Ed talked about it. Look, you are going to have to get creative and layer funding. I go back to a comment I made earlier, having been the executive director of a state housing agency and approving QAPs. It's one of those things, again, where there are a whole bunch of people who can come in before we finalize the QAP and meet, right? And so those who come organized, a collection of housing authorities who have been impacted by disasters, coming into an executive director and board of a housing finance agency saying we need priority points because we have these needs. We serve the most vulnerable in our community and we have no place to place them. We want to build decent, safe, and sanitary housing to bring them back to our community. Do that. You can also advocate from day one. I encourage you all to have in your speaking points when people ask what you need, to say we need a special allocation of 9% tax credits. We need CDBG DR funding. We need, and just everything you possibly can add from the various resources that we've talked about up here. Put those in your talking points, right? Put those in your talking points to communicate. Again, North Carolina got left out because it just didn't hear from them, right? So you want to make sure that those who are in the place to advocate for your communities that have been impacted are hearing what it is that you need. And these things have been done before. The beauty of it is you could call Ed. You can find me, call me. There's only way. I'll give you my number. And I can tell you where it's been done before. That's the great thing, in Congress and in Washington, is precedent, right? Pointing to a precedent. There's a precedent that's been established to do this, and we're not unlike that community that have these resources made available to them. But I really encourage you all, if you take nothing else, like the partnership among housing authorities, the sister relationships, for things, Ed talked about it, now, even being able to do the day-to-day functions. For a while, you may not have the capacity because your own people may be impacted, right? And they're trying to take care of the family and things like that. And so you're short-staffed. But being able to take someone from housing authority that's still having blue sky days, who knows how, can just make phone calls and get in touch with your voucher residents. I mean, if that is something as simple as that, right, to augment your staff at the time, to already have those relationships set up is important. It's not a long-term housing, but again, recovery begins on the first day of response, right? So these things, knowing where your people are, what their needs are, and how you can go about advocating for them is important to impact your long-term housing solutions.
Thank you, Fred. So these next two slides, again, you should have access to all of these slides to be able to have in the future. These are hyperlinks for insurance resources that are available. And then a lot of the additional resources that we've talked about over the past 2 days to include the HUD resources. Again, there's multiple templates, there's tools, there's fact sheets, there's also additional webinars in the disaster space. Same with federal grant programs to include FEMA for public assistance, mitigation. Washington specific is not on here, but you can always Google your state EM for Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, Washington, and make sure that you know who those contacts are. There's disaster planning education resources across whether it's the CDC or looking at other ready.gov resources and FEMA.gov, and then some of the external partners when it comes to disaster assistance and national VOAD. So this concludes when it comes to the recovery piece. I do just want to go ahead and first ask everyone to first thank you, panel. You've been fantastic. But I want to start with what is each takeaway that you would like to make sure that a message that goes back to the PHAs. So I'll start with Ron and work my way down.
Planning is your best exercise. It's going to be where you spend the bulk of your time, I think, in terms of that whiteboard exercise that I referenced yesterday. Map it out, ask the questions, get the right people in the room, do the what ifs, go from the epicenter on the way out, and take the time to do it. So large or small housing authority, make sure you sit around the round table to get your team together, look at the things that could happen, likely to happen, less likely to happen, impact, big or small, but make it a priority to make the plan.
So I was thinking, what do I want to end with? Okay, a couple quick things. One, we talked about mitigation and that kind of piece and funding for different things. But one thing I want to think about is we talk about, you have age facilities up to 100 years old in some places, is that it's not sometimes if it's going to be damaged, it's when. So as you look at your spaces, just ask the question like, well, if I had to fix this, what would I do better? And think about that now. Some of that is at work. Some of that may cause the conversation like, well, I can apply for a mitigation grant now, or it's just an option like, hey, if this facility floods, I want to get after elevating the utilities, the water heater, things of that nature. So think about that now, because when we talk about alternate projects and mitigation you can include in like public assistance damages or others. If you think about it now, it makes the process later like, hey, you know what questions to ask and what resources to ask from FEMA and the state when you look at those options going forward. So that's kind of what I want to leave you there. And kind of on the planning side is look at similar situations. And there's a case study I'm going to try to get out to you all that keep in mind. They had a assisted living facility down in Montesano and then Grays Harbor. I talked to a resident there where they had overnight had a fire and they had to move 70 inpatients at different levels of acuity, I mean like mobility things, overnight because there was a fire, the power was out. So that's an example of kind of an urgent relocation due to an event. You might be able to get some lessons learned. So I'm going to try to share that with you. But look at that within your community. Hey, was there an event in a neighboring community that I might be able to pull? It's not, hey, for public housing priority, but it's a movement and readjustment for large numbers of people. And how do they get after? Maybe there's some lessons or tools you can take out of that event. So expand kind of maybe your scope of what you're looking at that might give you information for planning and preparedness.
Thank you.
Very good. Well, first of all, thank you for tolerating this Californian for a couple days, especially beat up, scarred Californian. But I wanted to go back to this mission idea because in my mind, mission drives everything in what we do. And disaster response brings that into acute focus and play. I've heard it said by my mentors that housing authorities were creatures of the 1930s of the New Deal. We're actually all about social justice. I don't know when the last time you heard those two words put together, but we used to talk about social justice all the time, and it's really been conspicuously absent for the last 10 or 15 years. But we are agents of engineering, social engineering. We're federal agents, and we experiment. I mean, we've never been, how should I say, geared up to where we're an entitlement program. But if you look at the landscape of the programs we've developed since the 1930s, we've approached affordable housing from every possible angle you can think of. We know all the answers. We know the answers to homelessness. It's simply a matter of scaling up. Where I'm going to with this is when you have a town like Paradise burned down, a town that basically accommodated extremely low-income seniors and disabled, cobbling together an existence in the foothills of the Sierras because they have a half of rebellion idea against society. That population got displaced. And so the bigger picture, as housing authorities, how do we advocate for these extremely low-income households who really have no voice in the system, especially when they lose their homes? And will Paradise ever be the same? And the answer, quite frankly, is no. It used to be a haven for extremely low-income, elderly, and disabled by virtue of the fact it's close enough to services, but its housing was affordable enough that seniors and low-income disabled could hang out there. That's no longer the case. And if you look at the way our society's resources play out, even our federal resources, they lend themselves to those who are functional. You know, like our Section 8 voucher public housing programs. You know, who do we serve? We serve the clients who can return the paperwork and who can function enough, whether it's with an advocate or not, that they can play the game. Up in Paradise, what we're seeing is the rebuilding, obviously to the advantage of those with resource and recourse. And discounting anybody who doesn't have the resource and recourse. We still have 6,000 households we think are homeless as a function of that disaster 5 years later. We can't help them. But this issue of social justice burns because it's what drives us. It's the mission. We are here to serve those folks who have no recourse. And so we do the best we can. We speak when we can. And so thank you for listening.
That's a hard act to follow. I really appreciate those comments. Right, this is like an awfully tempting soapbox to get on, so I'm gonna try and keep it short. Right, I'll say first, my 15 seconds of fame was right after the Gray and Elk fires in Spokane, where I was on local news and said, hey, all disasters begin and end locally, right? And it's incumbent on the folks in those communities to take a look at how to respond to the perils that threaten them, right? Not every incident is going to rise to the level where the federal government is going to be involved. It's not, I like to think that when you can count on FEMA to do a good job implementing its programs when they're switched on, but you can't count on FEMA's programs being switched on to as part of your plan to assist the people in your community, right? So that's the first thing. And the second thing, I'll just reiterate my pitch to work with your county emergency management officials when you're impacted by an incident and let them know what your damages are and what your needs are. Right, at the regional level, we can't articulate a good picture of what the state or community's needs are without you guys making that connection, offering that information. And that's what drives the declaration process. It's an assessment of local needs against a set of criteria. And right, every sort of tile in that mosaic is important to building out a fulsome picture of why federal assistance is required. And that helps us get those programs rolling.
So I'll continue to be schizophrenic and I'll pretend that I'm still with HUD. We're from the government and we're here to help. And so it is true that HUD is there to help you. Janet Goldrick, who Felicia referred to as the new me, Janet was my deputy when I was a deputy assistant secretary in the early 2000s. She is one of the hardest working, most dedicated people I know. and she makes it to every one of those communities and, comes in and says, what can I do to help? But she takes that information and brings it to every corner of Washington she can. Meetings on the Hill, meetings over at the White House, certainly meetings with ongoing meetings with the secretary, right? But sometimes Janet can't make it, and the people in the back of the room are the ones who are going to be there, and they're going to be asking you for information probably on a daily basis at the time when you feel least capacity to provide them that information, but it is necessary. And then I'll say what I've said before, advocate for yourself. Advocate for yourself. You have to continue to advocate. Ed talked about the news cycle. There will be, Maria happened and Harvey happened within weeks of each other, right? And the news didn't know where to go, right? But eventually they left both places, and they still are trying to recover from both those disasters, right? We don't think about it. And so you have to stay on the minds of the decision makers at your state level, at your local level, and certainly at your federal level. And the only way you do that is to continue to advocate for yourself and for your residents until you fully recovered.
I guess takeaways would be remember DR as a potential option for cobbling together funding. Just remember, temper expectations because of the timeline and the kind of rigorous administrative process and strings attached to that. I will throw in that the Department of Commerce does have a very small state-funded program, $5 million per fiscal year for what I would call more response efforts. So your immediate needs, if you need to rent a generator for a couple weeks, or your water goes out and you need to ship in bottled water for your folks, etc. So that is another little side program. Again, this is all about cobbling together, right? Preparing in sunny days and being aware of what your various funding sources and opportunities may be, and cobbling it together. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know Kenton had to step out, but if he would just reiterate the importance of having a relationship with your insurance broker, making sure that you know who they are, that you have their current contact, and you're reviewing both what is included and excluded from your current policies to make sure that you're fully covered. So with this being said, I'm going to ask if... Yeah, okay. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and break for lunch. We can come back at 1. We are going to go over the disaster readiness plan. We're going to break out into groups, just navigate through this plan. You have the subject matter experts here. Now's the time to ask the questions. Say, what did you mean that maybe you didn't feel like you could in this large setting? Same with the people on the Zoom call. If we can just go ahead for them as well. We will check in with you all after lunch at 1 so we can work through your disaster readiness plans as well. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I'll look forward to talking with everyone after lunch.